As we continue through the month of Elul, I continue sharing Enter These Gates, Meditations for the Days of Awe by student Rabbi Eldon Solovey. One of the sections of his book is the Books of Life, and he quotes from Talmud, from the Babylonian Talmud, Tractate Rosh Hashanah 16b, which says 3 books are open in heaven on Rosh Hashanah. One of holy wicked people, one of holy righteous people, and one for those people in between, neither holy nor wicked. And he shares 3 poems, one about each of these books, and then he has 2 other poems, the Book of Forgiving and the Book of Living. And I'm going to share one of these poems, I'll share both, the Book of Forgiving and the Book of Living, because they work together, actually, in partnership. And the idea here is that we are not likely to be written in the book of the holy wicked, we're not likely to be written in the book of the holy righteous, but we are in between. But I think there's something very lovely here about Eldon Solovey adding these books of forgiving and the book of living. So I'm going to share these 2 and reflect on them afterwards. The Book of Forgiving. Remember and inscribe us in the book of forgiving. The book of forgiving ourselves, the book of forgiving each other, the book of forgiving our families, the book of forgiving our friends, the book of forgiving our faults, the book of forgiving our weaknesses, the book of forgiving our mistakes, the book of forgiving our misdeeds, the book of forgiving poor choices, the book of forgiving lost opportunities, so long as we have breath in our bodies and sparks in our souls. As long as we live, let us be alive in service to our God, our people, and all of humanity. The Book of Living. Remember and inscribe us in the book of living. The book of living in wonder. The book of living in awe. The book of living in righteousness. The book of living your Torah. The book of living your mitzvot. The book of living tikkun olam. The book of living tzedakah. The book of living each day fully. The book of living each day faithfully. The book of living each day for you. So long as we have breath in our bodies and sparks in our souls, as long as we live, let us be alive in service to our God, our people, and all of humanity. 2 interesting poems, very similar to each other in terms of their structure, quite deliberately. One the Book of Forgiving and the other the Book of Living. And I find these interesting, quite challenging, actually, because the idea of these metaphors from Tractate Rosh Hashanah is that it really is a very patriarchal view of God, God on high. God who is sealing us, judging us, God like a king. But what we have here reflected in these poems, and this is not surprising from Eldon Solovey at all, is a more internal God, I think. That's the way I read it. God who writes us in the book of forgiving that we might forgive ourselves. God who writes us in the book of living that we might live in wonder, that we might live in awe. And so I think there's a very interesting, very important thing that he's doing here, which is taking this rather challenging metaphor of God as king, God as ruler above us all, basically, and making it much more human, much more real. Because it can be very difficult for some people during the High Holy Days to really approach God. The theme of Rosh Hashanah in particular in the liturgy is God's kingship, God's rulership. But Americans don't have a king, and I've spoken before about British people's relationship with the monarchy, which is very interesting. But it's not the same. It's a metaphor for God's rulership over us, God's control over our lives almost, or God's being able to judge ultimately. No one can judge but God. Some of this is quite hard, what he's suggesting. The book of forgiving ourselves. If we get really honest, really open with ourselves, it can be very hard actually to forgive ourselves. The book of forgiving each other. Well, that's actually, I think, in general, fairly easy. We can turn around to people and we can forgive them, especially people who we might encounter once a week, once a month, and so on. Forgiving our families, I think that tends to be more difficult, and that may be a personal reflection on myself. But these are the people who we've grown up with, who we interact with every day. We tend to assume they have certain ways of behaving, and so forgiving them is actually, I think, much more difficult. Forgiving our friends, I think that tends to be easier again. Forgiving our faults, well, how is that different to forgiving ourselves? That's actually very interesting. That means, at first, when you read forgiving ourselves, I assumed it meant faults, but maybe it actually means the sort of life's directions and choices that we make. The fact that we might engage in things that don't make the world a better place. That's not necessarily a fault. Sometimes there's that balance that we have to find between the Yetzer HaTov and the Yetzer Hara, between the good inclination and the evil inclination. And my guess is, and it's a guess, my guess is that what Alden Solovey is doing here is, when he talks about forgiving ourselves, I think he's talking about forgiving ourselves for not having the right balance. And in this book of living, the book of living in wonder, in awe, in righteousness, in Torah, and in mitzvot, in one of the High Holy Day sermons, I'm actually going to be talking about this during the Yom Kippur morning sermon. Because living in awe, living in wonder, that's great. I was going to say that's easy. It's not easy. But being able to stop and appreciate the world around us, that is something that we can do. Living in righteousness, living in mitzvot, living in Torah, living with commandment, living with duty, that's a different matter. That's actually much harder. Living the book of living tzedakah, we can do that. And in fact, at Temple Beth Shalom, we're going to be helping with that. A rather wonderful project that is coming that you'll hear about on Rosh Hashanah. The book of living each day for you, for God. What does that mean? I think that necessitates community. I think that necessitates communal conversation to say, what does it mean to live a life for God? So I think that draws us together. Where living in wonder and awe may be personal, living each day for you, I think, is communal. And then right at the end, as long as we live, let us be alive in service to our God, our people, and all of humanity. It's a really interesting order that he puts them. Of course, service to God first. I understand that. But then service to our people, that's very particularistic. And then service to all humanity, that's very universalistic. And that's actually something I'm going to be looking at during the Erev Rosh Hashanah sermon. How we balance universalism and particularism. How American liberal Jews tend to be much more universalist. Our traditions tends to be much more particularist. And how we need to find a balance between them. So these two readings by Alden Solovey, the Book of Forgiving and the Book of Living, I think are important because I wrestle with them a little. I wrestle with how he understands God. And what does God mean for us at this time? What does it mean to forgive at this time? To forgive ourselves, to forgive others? What do we need to do to forgive? If a person hasn't asked for forgiveness, are we obliged to forgive them? Our tradition says no. But we may want to, just because forgiving someone lets go of all the pain and hatred, the anger, the resentment. And yet, we live and we learn. We don't forget it, we just let go of it. What that means is we make sure it doesn't affect us emotionally. And the book of living, I guess, is the other way. This is more active. The book of really appreciating we have only one life. And in all the history of the universe, there never has been and never will be anyone like us. Therefore, we need to make sure that we live the best life that we can. And the question is, how do we work out what that is? I hope you'll be able to join us for our Kabbalat Shabbat service this evening. We've got Chaplain Joe giving the sermon. Chaplain Joe is a mensch. He goes around in Santa Fe and helps the unhoused, the homeless. He knows where they sleep in arroyos and so on, so he's able to have a close relationship with them and support them. He'll be coming to talk about some of his work in our Kabbalat Shabbat service this evening. We have Torah study tomorrow. We'll be looking at the month of Elul and what does it mean, and how do we get the most out of it. And our Shabbat Shacharit service tomorrow is our second conservative service. From a different Siddur. It has more prayers. We're tweaking this service based on the feedback from last time. I do hope you'll be able to join us for it. It's a really interesting, different way to pray, and I really encourage members of our community to explore as many different ways of prayer as possible. I hope to see you over our Shabbat services. See you soon and wish you Shabbat Shalom.